Paradise Lost. It's the greatest poem in the English language, and in it, Satan is represented heroically. Now, I didn't say that Satan is the hero, because he's not. Or is he? No, he's not. Unless... So Paradise Lost is an epic poem written by John Milton in the 17th century from around the late 1660s into the 1670s. It is modeled after the epics of Homer and Virgil, the great classical or ancient epics. And it tells the story of Adam and Eve's temptation and their fall in the Garden of Eden. It's the Garden of Eden story. But we also get this whole story of Satan's rebellion against God. We got God explaining how it is that he can know everything and be all powerful, but not stop bad things from happening. We get the creation story. It's wild, honestly. It's about eating the fruit from the tree. It's about temptation and rebellion and knowledge. Generally speaking, I think there's three ways we can read Paradise Lost. First, we can kind of read it straight. Milton tells us at the beginning of the poem that his intention, his poet tells us, the speaker tells us, his intention is to justify the ways of God. So, to explain to us mortals why it is that we suffer, how it is that we fell, and why it was our fault. So the first way to read it is to say, Milton is trying to persuade us of God's justice and the justice of the universe. It's maybe a tall order. The second way to read it is this. It's very tempting. You see what I did there? And generations of readers, scholars have found something to this reading and are attracted to this reading, that actually, Milton is not on God's side. Milton is on Satan's side. That Satan is actually the hero of this poem. He's the charismatic hero. That all of our sympathy moves in his direction. And his cause, his rebellion, is actually just. And in that reading, the poem is remarkably subversive. A third option, and this is one I'm kind of partial to, is that Milton is earnestly trying to defend God's justice and the justice of the universe. He does not believe that Satan is the good guy. But the problem is, Milton has set for himself such an impossible task. He takes us into heaven. God is a character in this poem who speaks and explains himself. Adam gets in dialogues with angels about, whether angels have sex and, where they were when creation happened and, what happened first and what's the universe made of? All these enormous metaphysical questions. And I think one way we might read this poem is to say that Milton had the best of intentions, but that he bit off more than he could chew. And the task that he sets for himself is so ambitious, kind of ironic in a poem about pride, that his task is so ambitious that he falters, he stumbles, he gets himself into trouble. He introduces more problems than he resolves. I think there may also be another way to read the poem, but I'll come back to that later. Let me give you an example of a problem or a curiosity in this poem. So in Book 8 of Paradise Lost, God, he sends Raphael, the angel Raphael, down to talk to Adam and Eve and warn them that Satan is coming to tempt them. So they're getting this is literally fair warning. Do not be tempted. Do not be tricked. And after Raphael does that, he gets into this conversation with Adam and he says, well, actually, Adam, I'd like to hear about creation. I'd like to hear about your first day of existence. And Raphael doesn't know about this because he says, for I that day was absent, as befell, bound on a voyage uncouth and obscure, far on excursion towards the gates of hell. Squared in full legions, such command we had, to see that none thence issued forth a spy, or enemy, while God was in his work, lest he, incensed at such eruption bold, destruction with creation might have mixed. Not that they durst without his leave attempt, but us he sends upon his high behest for state, as sovereign king, and to inure our prompt obedience. Okay, so in this passage, we can actually understand all the tensions in the poem. So just so we have it down, what Raphael says in this moment is that on the day Adam was created, he and some other angels were sent to guard the gates of hell so that the fallen angels could not escape and then make God angry. And he'd get so angry that he'd destroy them and mix creation with destruction. Okay, let's start there. But then Raphael qualifies, of course, they could not have gotten out unless God let them out. But he sends us there. Why? Because here's the thing. If the fallen angels can't get out of hell, if they can't escape hell unless God lets them out, then why does he need the guards? So he sends guards there to prevent them from getting out, but they're not going to get out. So he sends guards there even though he knows they can't escape. So it's just like angelic busy work. And then God his justification is that he's worried that if they get out, even though they can't get out, then he might kind of mix up creation and destruction or pollute creation with destruction. So like, would God then be doing something he doesn't want to do, like something against his will? Because that seems impossible, right? So here we get the whole problem, right? So this poem is really about the nature of freedom and how we understand freedom in the context of a Christian universe in which, God is all-knowing and all-powerful, in which, providence or predestination of a kind plays a role. How is it we are free if God wills everything that is? How do we reconcile our freedom, the angel's freedom, human freedom? How do we reconcile that with the idea that nothing can happen that God does not allow to happen? Or maybe even that God does not will to happen. And it's not an incidental question in the context of this poem, because this is how Satan escapes. In book 1, we meet Satan and he's chained up on the floors of hell. And then he gets up. So stretched out huge in length the archfiend lay, chained on the burning lake, nor ever thence had risen nor heaved his head, but that the will and high permission of all ruling heaven left him at large to his own dark designs, that with reiterated crimes he might heap on himself damnation, while he sought evil to others, and enraged might see how all his malice served but to bring forth infinite goodness, grace, and mercy shown on man by him seduced. Satan is allowed to escape hell. He's allowed by God, right, to escape hell, even though God knows Satan is going to tempt us. And he's allowed to do all that, to escape, to tempt us, even though God knows that humanity is going to fall, right? That we will be tempted. We will do the wrong thing. And we will doom ourselves. Milton is right. This is a God that needs some justification. Because we might say, how is this a God that loves us? And this is where we maybe start sympathizing with Satan, because Satan's argument throughout the poem is that this God is a tyrant. He rules by tradition and custom, and he's a monarch, and we are not equal, and that is unjust. And here, complicating matters, we need to understand something about Milton's politics. So the middle of the 17th century, very turbulent time in England. There is actually a civil war, the English Civil War. Before there's an American Revolution, before there's a French Revolution, there's actually an English Revolution, right? There's a civil war, and England becomes a republic. They depose their king, King Charles. They execute Charles. Temporarily, they become a republic. And Milton, in fact, is on the Republican side. In fact, he served in the Republican government. He was kind of like a translator for the government. He's not just your average poet. So Milton is a Republican. And in this poem, Satan is the one with all the Republican arguments. And God is the monarch whose justice is questioned. So this is provocative, right? This is a problem. Is this poem meant to demonstrate God's justice or expose his injustice? Well, one way we might resolve this, right, is to recognize that there's a difference between a human being as an absolute monarch and a perfectly good being who is perfectly rational and perfectly loving as an absolute monarch. If you could imagine a perfect being, then absolute monarchy is absolutely the way you'd want to govern things. So it's possible that monarchy suits the government of the universe, but does not actually suit mortal governments. Monarchy maybe doesn't work if the monarch is imperfect. So it might be that the flaws of human monarchies don't apply to divine monarchy. And so maybe this God is just, But if we're going to decide that, if we're going to interpret it that way, we need to reckon with what's going on in the Garden of Eden. We got to talk about this tree, right? The tree of knowledge. And there's one prohibition in the garden. You can't eat from the tree. Any tree you want, right? All the food you want is available to you. You can't eat from this one tree. It's like a booby trap in a sense, right? The garden, there's a trap in the garden. If you eat the tree, you're done. You're dead. Death is your punishment. One thing we might ask, right, as we're reading the poem, as we're thinking about the Garden of Eden story, why is the tree there at all? Why do we need the tree in the garden? Why didn't you just make a garden with no tree? But I think that the really interesting thing, you could argue that the tree is necessary for human freedom to be manifest. If the tree is not there, if there's no law, if there's no prohibition, then there is no way for us to demonstrate our obedience, our love, and our freedom. If the garden is just about like following our natural inclinations and like doing whatever feels good, then that's arguably not freedom, right? Freedom might necessitate, it might like just be about self-government. And unless we're deciding like to do a thing or not to do a thing based on some sort of principle, then maybe we're not free. So it would seem then, right, that maybe the tree is necessary for our freedom. That's what the story's about. When Milton, when he introduces us to his God in book 3, we hear God kind of defend himself, and he sounds a little defensive, honestly. And one thing he says this about the angels actually, but it also applies to us. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. Not free, what proof could they have given sincere of true allegiance? Constant faith or love, where only what they needs must do appeared, not what they would. What praise could they receive? What pleasure I from such obedience paid? So this God, he's a jealous God, and he wants love, and he wants praise, but he says, it doesn't matter to me. Like, I can't, if I make a bunch of slave beings who just automatically love me, then that love has no value. That praise has no value. It's only valuable if we are free beings. Then our allegiance, then our love, then our loyalty actually means something. So as you read this poem, there is this sense that, all of God's actions, they make sense if freedom is the most important thing. If our freedom and free will is the most important thing. Because if that's the most important thing, then he has to let us fall. It's kind of like a parent. I think the parenting analogy is apt. So we could wrap our kids in bubbles and never let them do anything, and they'd be safe. Maybe we could, protect them, but they wouldn't be free, and they wouldn't be able, they wouldn't be able to develop themselves and make their own choices. We couldn't really take as much pride or admire their choices as much if they're not free choices. God seems to value freedom over our safety, over our security. In this weird way, it's almost as if he might even value freedom over our goodness. Because if it's not free, then it's not really good. Because if our actions are not free, then in some fundamental sense, they can't actually be good. So pain, suffering, the fall of humanity, all of it, it seems, in Milton's account, is worth freedom. Freedom makes it worth it. And it's interesting when you think about contemporary conversations about politics, because, especially in democracies, we adopt a similar rhetoric, and we kind of understand this, right? That we want freedom more than anything else. We cherish our freedom, and we're willing to sacrifice a lot of things so long as we can keep our freedom. Now, sometimes these debates get very cartoonish, right? And people perceive any inconvenience as an assault on their freedom. And that, I think, is a kind of perversion of this argument. So like being asked to do anything at all, any law or prohibition is interpreted as tyranny. That, I think, is a bit silly. And here, Milton's representation of Satan, I think, is quite prescient, because that's the language Satan uses. Satan sees any kind of service, any kind of subordination as slavishness. Any kind of subordination or inequality is viewed by Satan as an imposition, a kind of tyrannical imposition. And that, I think, Milton wants us to recognize is a kind of collapsing of categories. It's not rational. Because here's the thing. If God is good, you do want to be subordinate to God. You do want to follow God. If God is good, really good, then you want to obey him. And if you don't want to obey the God who is good, then that's not freedom, right? Like that's not like some expression of your nobility or your indomitable character. That's irrational and self-destructive. In certain situations, service is rational and good. In certain situations, obeying the law is rational and good if the law is good. And I think what Milton would say is to look at any law that is an imposition on us, right? That inconveniences us in any way, and read that as some kind of tyrannical overreach. Well, that's very self-serving, right? It's very self-serving. And what's actually happening there is we're slaves to ourselves, much like Satan is in this poem, right? We're slaves to ourselves because it's our inclinations, it's our comfort and our convenience that we want to govern the world, right? That's the principle. What I want is the principle for what's good. And this, it maybe brings us to this. I mentioned like a fourth way to read this poem. The fourth way, might be about recognizing that Milton is smarter than us. And it may be that these various like problems that crop up in the poem that make you kind of ponder and wonder and want to contradict and argue, maybe those are kind of like traps. I think Milton is encouraging us to be a good interpreter, to be good readers, to be good thinkers, to be rational, and to recognize faulty arguments when we see them. And so I think he gives us lots of difficult and thorny arguments. Sometimes Satan gives us charismatic, really beautiful arguments that, when you really think about them, don't amount to very much. Actually, they're contradictory and they make no sense. And I think so, in a way, the poem itself, I think, is teaching us to be good thinkers, to be rational, and therefore to be free. Yeah, I think that's right. My name is Dr. Moore. I teach great books at St. Thomas University. Check out another video on Paradise Lost over here. Thanks very much. Talk soon.